Errol Flynn's widow has finally shattered 70 years of silence, confirming what Hollywood itself spent decades denying: the scandal that tainted his name, the whispers that haunted his legend, were never just rumors. They were the open wound that defined him, the shadow behind the smile that once lit up every cinema screen. For the first time, Patrice Wymore, the woman who stood beside Flynn through fame, exile, and heartbreak, has confessed what really happened behind those closed doors. She's no longer protecting his myth. At 85, she's telling the truth. And it's far more complex, more human, and far darker than anyone imagined. When the headlines first exploded in 1942, the studios went silent. The man who embodied adventure itself, the charming swashbuckler of Captain Blood and Robin Hood, was suddenly dragged from the silver screen into the cold light of a courtroom. The accusations were shocking, too sordid for the image of Hollywood's golden boy. He was acquitted, yet his reputation never healed. For decades, the whispers never died, and Patrice, the woman who shared his final, fading years, endured that silence as a burden. Now she's done hiding the truth. Her confession doesn't condemn him, it exposes the ruthless system that built him, broke him, and buried the evidence. The same system that turned Errol Flynn into both a sinner and scapegoat, a man forever trapped between legend and loss. Before the scandal, Flynn wasn't just a movie star. He was the image of freedom, the embodiment of reckless charm. Born in 1909 in the far reaches of Hobart, Tasmania, he rose from restless obscurity to become Warner Brothers' brightest flame, the man every studio wanted and every audience adored. When Captain Blood stormed theaters in 1935, the world found its hero, reckless, witty, with danger in his grin. Flynn wasn't just acting, he was living the adventure. Within 3 short years, the adventures of Robin Hood sealed his legend forever. Errol Flynn became the living embodiment of excitement, daring, impulsive, and utterly impossible to control. Studio executives shaped that image carefully. They needed a man who could make Depression-era audiences forget their fears, a living fantasy of courage and rebellion. Flynn played along, smiling through the carefully scripted illusion. Reporters called him the real-life Robin Hood. And the gossip column, well, they whispered about midnight parties, champagne excess, and women drawn to his magnetic recklessness. Hollywood looked the other way, as long as his films kept breaking records. But success has a price. And by the early 1940s, Flynn's wild life was no longer charming. It was dangerous. His private escapades began to dominate headlines more than his performances. He sailed up the California coast in his yacht, throwing parties that started as publicity stunts and ended as whispers. The press adored it, the studios feared it, and behind that grin, his closest friends saw the truth: a man unraveling, losing control of the legend he was forced to live. Then came 1942, 2 teenage girls, 2 accusations that would change everything. The story broke like an earthquake, and Hollywood would never be the same. It was 1942, the year when America's favorite hero became its greatest scandal. 2 teenage girls accused Errol Flynn of crimes too dark for the man who once wore Robin Hood's smile. The nation was stunned. The press couldn't look away, and Hollywood, terrified of what might come next, fell completely silent. Warner Brothers executives panicked. They had built Flynn's image as the perfect rogue, charming, fearless, and irresistibly reckless. Now, those same qualities were being used to destroy him. Fans were divided. Moral crusaders demanded his banishment, and Flynn, the man who had once laughed in the face of danger, found himself cornered, this time not by villains on a movie set, but by the relentless glare of public judgment. The trial became a spectacle unlike anything Hollywood had ever seen. Outside the Los Angeles courthouse, photographers screamed his name. Inside, the jury listened as the girls took the stand, trembling, their every word devoured by journalists hungry for a headline. America wanted to know whether its beloved Robin Hood was, in fact, the villain of his own fairy tale. The prosecution painted him as a predator intoxicated by fame. The defense portrayed the girls as opportunists, coached, manipulated, and eager for their own piece of notoriety. Day after day, the newspapers printed every line of testimony. Evening editions turned the courtroom into serialized entertainment. It wasn't justice anymore, it was theater. Behind the scenes, the machinery of Hollywood spun at full speed. Warner Brothers hired private investigators, bribed editors, and quietly financed Flynn's defense, pretending all the while to be neutral. Studio fixers scrubbed the darkest rumors before they reached the headlines. Columnists were paid to soften the narrative, to shift the story from criminality to mischief. In public, they maintained the illusion of distance. In private, they were fighting for survival. After a month of relentless spectacle, the jury reached its decision. Not guilty. The words erupted through the courtroom like thunder. Cheers filled the hallway. Fans wept with relief. But Flynn didn't smile because he knew an acquittal was not redemption. The stain would never wash away. In Like Flynn, the phrase was born that day, courtroom slang turned into permanent scar. Hollywood had cleared its ledger, but not his soul. His name, once synonymous with adventure, was now entangled with scandal. And while the headlines faded, the damage remained. Studio invitations slowed. The roles grew smaller, the budgets cheaper. The man who had once been the beating heart of Warner Brothers was now their unspoken liability. By the time Patrice Wymore entered his life 8 years later, Flynn was no longer the golden hero. He was a man exiled by his own fame, hiding behind laughter that didn't reach his eyes. When Patrice Wymore met Errol Flynn in 1950, the legend had already begun to fade. He was 41, worn, restless, and carrying the invisible weight of a decade of disgrace. She was just 24, a bright, elegant Broadway actress, newly signed to Warner Brothers. He courted her with the same effortless charm that once enchanted millions. But behind that the sparkle lay a man unraveling, and Patrice would soon see what the public never did. Their marriage was nothing like the fairy tales his movies promised. Behind closed doors, she saw the wreckage left by fame. There were unpaid taxes, bitter lawsuits, fading contracts, and nights drowned in whiskey and regret. To outsiders, they were the perfect Hollywood couple, beautiful, exotic, and endlessly photographed. But to insiders, they were simply surviving. Two people bound by love and exhaustion. Flynn drank through sleepless nights, laughed through pain, and clung to a dying belief that the world still adored him. Hollywood wanted the legend, not the man, and Patrice learned quickly that silence was the only protection left. By 1959, the curtain had fallen. Flynn's health collapsed, the price of years of alcohol, anxiety, and heartbreak. On October 14th, during a visit to Vancouver, he collapsed in the back seat of a car. He never woke up. The autopsy listed heart failure and cirrhosis. He was just 50 years old. Even in death, he couldn't escape the past. The newspapers printed his obituary beside the same scandal headlines that had haunted him for 17 years, as if his story had come full circle, the sinner finally claimed by his sins. For Patrice, widowhood brought a silence and suspicion. She returned to their Jamaican estate, raising their daughter alone away from the cameras. She refused interviews, refused Hollywood's crocodile sympathy. The world had already judged her husband. She wouldn't let it judge her too. But time has a way of breaking down walls. As the decades passed, she began to speak. Softly at first, then with growing clarity, not to defend him, not to romanticize him, but to tell the truth that had been buried with him. And what she revealed would change everything we thought we knew about Errol Flynn's fall. When Patrice Wymore finally spoke, decades after Errol Flynn's death, her words carried the weight of someone who had lived too long inside a lie. She had protected him out of loyalty, out of love, and perhaps out of fear. But at 85, there was nothing left to protect. What she revealed wasn't a romantic defense. It was an autopsy of an entire system that devoured its own. She confirmed what many had only whispered, that the 1942 scandal wasn't just about Errol Flynn's recklessness, but about Hollywood's fear. Powerful men, studio heads, producers, fixers, had buried evidence, rewritten the stories, and used Flynn's downfall as a smokescreen. They needed a scapegoat, and he was perfect, charismatic, reckless, and already controversial enough to distract the public. Flynn's trial, she said, had been half truth and half performance. The prosecution wanted a monster. The studios needed a distraction. And Errol, too proud, too arrogant, too broken, walked straight into the fire. Patrice revealed that the studio fixers destroyed photos and documents, linking several influential figures to the same underage parties. Flynn's trial had been the shield that protected the empire. He wasn't innocent, she admitted softly in one interview, but he wasn't alone either. Her tone wasn't defensive, it was weary, almost mournful. She explained that Hollywood in the 1940s had perfected its own version of morality: create the scandal, sell the story, then destroy whoever became inconvenient. Historians would later prove her right. Archival documents revealed how studio publicity departments manipulated newspapers, buying silence, inventing rumors, and reshaping the narrative until the public believed what it was told. Flynn was both a star and a pawn, destroyed not only by his own excesses, but by the very dream machine that created him. For Patrice, the cost was lifelong. Every public appearance came with whispers. Every anniversary of Flynn's death brought journalists asking the same cruel question. Did he really do it? She would deflect, smile politely, and change the subject. But as she aged, the burden of silence became unbearable. You can only carry silence for so long, she told one reporter. It starts to sound like guilt. Her confession didn't erase Flynn's flaws, it illuminated them. He had been reckless, indulgent, and self-destructive, but he was also a man consumed by a system that rewarded risk until it threatened profit. And when it did, the system sacrificed him. By the time she broke her silence, Hollywood had already changed. New generations looked back at Flynn not as a monster, but as a cautionary figure, a man destroyed by fame before the world even understood what fame could do. After Patrice Wymore's death in 2014, something remarkable happened. Hollywood, the same machine that had once devoured her husband, began to look inward. Film historians, journalists, and archivists reopened the dusty boxes that contained Flynn's court transcripts, studio memos, and forgotten correspondence. What they found didn't absolve him, but it did expose how carefully his story had been managed. Court records revealed inconsistencies long ignored by public opinion. Studio files uncovered how Warner Brothers and other executives had coordinated the press, feeding reporters selective details to preserve the illusion of control. For decades, these documents had been sealed, quietly hidden away to protect reputations that outlived their owners. Now, under the light of modern scrutiny, they told a different story, one less about guilt or innocence and more about manipulation. Modern audiences raised on the language of celebrity scandals began to see Flynn's story for what it truly was, a prototype of the self-destructive star, a man consumed by an industry that turned fame into both a blessing and a curse. Directors admired his artistry, historians dissected his collapse, and through Patrice's honesty, people began to see the man behind the myth. He was no longer just the fallen hero of 1942, nor the carefree Robin Hood who swung from castle walls. He was both, intertwined forever. Patrice's confession gave his duality meaning. She painted him as flawed but human, reckless yet searching for belonging in a world built on illusion. Those who once dismissed her as the naive widow of a scandalized star began to realize the depth of her understanding. She had lived inside the very machinery that destroyed him, and when she finally spoke, she did not seek forgiveness. She sought truth. Her words reframed the entire narrative. Errol Flynn was not the cautionary tale of a sinner punished, but the emblem of a larger tragedy, a man undone by the same industry that demanded his perfection. Hollywood, through him, revealed its own reflection, a place where morality was performance and reputation a currency. For Patrice, her confession was liberation. For the world, it was revelation. She reminded us that behind every icon lies a human being, one capable of brilliance and ruin, often in the same breath. Time did what Hollywood could not. It stripped away the glamour, the scandal, and the noise, leaving behind only the outline of two people who had lived inside a storm. Errol Flynn's legend had begun as fiction, but it ended in revelation, not because his widow defended him, but because she dared to tell the world what it had refused to see. Patrice Wymore's voice came decades too late for absolution, yet exactly in time for understanding. Her confession wasn't loud or bitter. It was measured, precise, painfully human. She didn't beg the world to forgive him. She simply asked it to remember him, not as the myth, not as the scandal, but as the man who bore both. Through her honesty, the myth unraveled. The charming pirate of the silver screen became something more fragile and far more real. He was proof that fame is a double-edged sword, that the dream factory could build gods only to destroy them for profit. Flynn's downfall was never just his own doing. It was the reflection of an entire era, a time when the studios demanded heroes, then created the scandals to feed the same hungry public they pretended to protect. And yet, even in ruin, he endured. His films, Captain Blood, The Adventures of Robin Hood, Gentleman Jim, still flicker across television screens, their colors restored, their hero eternally young. But now, when audiences watch him swing from castle walls or flash that irresistible grin, they see more than adventure. They sense the fragility behind it, the man hiding inside the legend. Patrice once called his life a storm that never ended. In that single phrase, she revealed the truth neither of them could escape. Errol Flynn was not simply a sinner or a saint, but both, forever entangled, forever misunderstood. And by breaking her silence, Patrice didn't rewrite history. She clarified it. Her final gift to the world was not a defense, but perspective. That behind every perfect smile lies a human story, a story of brilliance, indulgence, and consequence. Together, they embodied the contradictions of an era that demanded perfection and punished truth. And in the end, by speaking the words Hollywood tried to bury, Patrice Y. Moore reclaimed something that neither fame nor scandal could destroy. The right for both of them to be remembered not as myths, not as monsters, but as people